Welcome, everyone, to the Religion Unplugged podcast. I am Joseph Holmes, resident culture critic at Religion Unplugged and host of the Overthinkers podcast, which is a separate podcast, but I'm happy to be hosting the Religion podcast today, particularly for our very special guest. He is Rabbi Shai Held. He is one of the most influential Jewish thinkers and leaders in America. He is president and dean of the Hadar Institute in New York City and received the prestigious Covenant Award for Excellence in Jewish Education and has been named in the Jewish Daily Forward as one of the most 50 most influential Jews in the world. He is the author of Abraham Joshua Heschel, A Call to Transcendence, and The Heart of the Torah, Essays on the Weekly Torah Portion. Rabbi Held, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Joseph.
No, it's really a pleasure. I was telling you beforehand that I didn't know who you were before reading the book, but that I very much enjoyed the book, and I looked you up afterwards so I could do the intro, and I was like, oh my gosh, this guy is like really cool. I'm very honored to be interviewing him today.
Thank you so much. As I mentioned to you earlier, my kids would tell you that calling me cool is a bit of, I don't know, unwarranted hyperbole.
Yes, we're showing my colors as being raised by two ordained ministers. I'm steeped in the theology nerddom, so perhaps that's coloring me a bit. But anyway, it's a really, really great honor. So I guess first start out, your book is Judaism is About Love. And so I guess the first question for our listeners who haven't read the book is, what is the premise of the book and why did you feel the need to write a book with a fairly maybe obvious seeming title that Judaism is about love?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So I think maybe the best way for me to answer it would be to share two experiences that I had many years ago, one of which that I talk about in the opening of the book and one of which I don't talk about in the book at all. The first is that I was speaking to a class of senior rabbinical students at a major American seminary, and I said in passing, Judaism tells the story of a God who loves us and beckons us to love God back. And a fifth-year rabbinical student said, I have to say somewhat sneeringly, he said, I'm sorry, but that sounds like Christianity to me. And I was really taken aback. And I said, I'm not sure how to respond to that other than to tell you that what I was thinking about is the twice-a-day Jewish liturgy in which we say to God, with vast love have you loved us, and then recite Deuteronomy, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your being and all your might. In other words, God loves us and beckons us to love God back. What it made me understand is that centuries of Christian anti-Judaism, centuries of, tragically, Christianity's relentless insistence that Judaism is in some sense a loveless religion, had been internalized by many, many Jews, including many devout and pious Jews, such that a fifth-year rabbinical student could say such a thing. I also had another experience that I think is really probably relevant for many of specifically Christian listeners. A few months after that, I was speaking at an interfaith conference, and this is a long time ago, so they still divided the students into Jews, Catholics, and Protestants. It was like out of the 1950s. And I'm speaking to a room of about 20 Protestant teenagers. And again, in passing, I say, remind me, what does Jesus say is the great commandment? And all 20 hands go up. I call on one of the students who proudly tells me about love of God and love of neighbor. And then I, in total innocence, say, and Jesus is quoting what? Not a single hand goes up. Not a single one. And I thought to myself, well, this is how it's possible for Christians to believe that Judaism is loveless. They have no idea what Jesus was nurtured in. They have no idea that he's quoting Leviticus and Deuteronomy. They just don't know that. And so my book, in some fundamental way, is written with two very different audiences in mind. I wrote it for Jews as an act of recovery, right? Let's reclaim what is fundamentally at the heart of the Jewish tradition, and heart in both senses, heart as in core and heart as in our hearts. And also for Christians, in the hopes that it would enable Christians to think and talk about Judaism in very different ways than have historically been the conventional ones. I mean, of course, I'd also love to read to reach readers who are just interested in love and ethics, but my primary goal here is to help Jews and Christians both think differently about Judaism.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that the opening of the book, how you framed it that way, I think was really fascinating to me, and it made a lot of sense because you see this happen in the political realm where people where in attempts to get people sort of on your side, they're sort of attending to straw man and propagandize about the other side. So every election cycle in America, the Democrats will call Republicans fascists, and Republicans will call Democrats Marxists or socialists. And there is this, there's definitely this attempt to say, okay, well, pitch Christianity as the superior religion, and therefore, okay, in order to do that, we're going to cast all other religions, including Judaism, as are all this way, and we're about this. I definitely again, I can sort of see for like the Christian audiences, there's two kind of Christians that I kind of run into. Ones who, and I experienced this a lot in college, and I experienced, there's professors of mine like Dr. Drew Johnson and some of the work that's done at the Center for Hebraic Thought, really like to emphasize the continuity between the what Christians call the Old and New Testaments, and they do that, to some degree, a large degree, saying, see, we are being faithful to the God of the Old Testament, who we believe wrote the New Testament. And that's kind of their pitch. A lot of their pitch is, well, the reason we can be proud to call ourselves Christians is because we believe that we're faithful to the whole narrative of the Bible. And so when they would read something like, Judaism is about love, your book, they would say, yes, these are many of the same arguments we're using to talk about the continuity between the Old and New Testaments. But of course, there's another group that, I've also encountered who, and I can say that it is very possible that this is the majority, that really, in order to kind of bump up their faith, they want to express the differences between Christianity and what they see as Christianity and Judaism, and say, well, we're about love and they're about law and things like that. And that's deeply tragic because, as you said, first of all, it runs in the face of the facts of the matter. Like you said, it requires you to have a certain degree of ignorance. As Jesus was quoting Deuteronomy, and he was also, the lawyer he was talking to in that story, who was, Jewish, was like, yes, you have this correctly. Like, you're interpreting Jesus was not saying really anything that was not accepted sort of consensus of what Judaism was at the time. He said, yes, you're right. We don't disagree with you at all. So that's a real difficulty. Now, I guess one of the things I'm interested in, so I can see, because I'm part of the Christian community, I can see what the controversy. First of all, Christians who read this book, there's most of the Christians who disagree with what you're saying in the book probably won't even know about your book or read your book. I think most of the Christians who'll be reading your book will be look at this and say, yes, this is really how wonderful this is for my faith and to seeing this continuity. I guess for your Jewish audience, I'm interested because this is a world that I'm less familiar with. For Jewish audience, what arguments, because you allude this sort of in your book that there are different ways you can interpret Judaism from within the Jewish community and Jewish tradition, as well as like what would you say, what do you expect sort of the response to be from practitioners of Judaism who think that the idea that Judaism is about love is sort of attempting a syncretism to sort of Christianity, who kind of holds the idea that Judaism is about law and that's a good thing, a good differential. But what are the arguments that they typically make, and what do you expect that response to your book would be? How does this book interact with that group?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question because there are several different types of responses that I've gotten over the years as I've lectured about these topics, and then I expect to hear from people as I travel and talk about the book. One is what I would call distinctions that are based on false dichotomies. So, for example, Judaism is not about love, Judaism is about law. Well, here's the thing. According to Jewish tradition, law itself is a revelation of divine love. Deuteronomy basically says that law is a means for God to be immanent. I mean, I would say here you see a real chasm between what we might call Martin Luther's spirituality on the one hand and rabbinic spirituality on the other. The law is not something in Judaism that we're supposed to break ourselves upon. Right? The law is something that is, God loves us so much that God gives us guidance as to how to make our way in the world and how to flourish. Deuteronomy likes to use the words litovlach in Hebrew, for your very flourishing, for your very own good, right? So there's that. When people say Judaism is not about love, Judaism is about law, I say Judaism is about law because it's about love. Right? And that's, by the way, also fundamentally part of the same liturgy I alluded to earlier, where we say each morning, right, you've loved us vastly and given us these laws and statutes. I think the word instruction is actually better than law, but that's maybe a discussion for another day.
I've heard that too, but yeah, that makes sense, yeah.
So that's one kind of response. Another response is to say, Judaism is really focused on what you do, on your deeds. And you're talking about emotions. And I would say I think that's mistaken for two reasons. Judaism is focused on what we do, but its ideal is a full integration of what we do and who we are on the inside. What Judaism does say is, look, even if you're not feeling love for your neighbor, act lovingly towards them, right? Because the neighbor can't wait for you to achieve virtue. Right? But that's different than saying Judaism doesn't care about virtue. Of course it does. It's just, saying, the world can't wait while people, pursue their virtue. I always like to say, you can't say, I'm going to spend the next 50 years alone in a room meditating and I'll come out when I've become compassionate. It's just not how it works in Judaism. So that's kind of one kind of response that I think is problematic. And then, the notion that what I'm talking about emotion is also complex. What I'm really talking about, this is very important to me. Love, as I am using it, is really less an emotion than what I call pretentiously, but it was helpful to me in my own thinking, an existential posture, a way of holding myself, a way of comporting myself, if you will. And it has to manifest in emotion, but it itself is not an emotion. A more philosophical way of saying this is that love is a disposition to feel and act in certain ways, right? And you find a lot of moral philosophers talking about love as a disposition. I find that helpful. And I'm certainly not talking about love in some hallmarky sense, right? I'm talking about love, in the abyss, love amidst really deep sorrow, sitting with people in the most unfathomable moments of pain and suffering. So, I really want to be clear about what we mean when we talk about love.
Yeah, no, I think that's really cool. And again, one of the things that's fascinating to me is that many of the things that you're saying are things that I heard growing up in church to describe, well, why is it if our God is a God of love that he has all these rules? Even again, we don't have, maybe we don't have the same rules or as many rules as traditional Judaism does. But we have quite a few. And so well, why does God have these rules? Well, because first of all, he wants to teach us how to live. And secondly, because if he doesn't, that's going to harm us in some way. And also the idea of love is not just a, again, it's like, hey, committing adultery will harm you. Killing people will harm you. There's certain things, and giving us those instructions and those fences, oftentimes the word, is an act of love to do that.
Right.
And also,
sorry, think about.
Sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry. No, just think for a second about being a parent, right? Yeah. I mean, a ruleless home is not one that a kid can healthily grow up in.
Absolutely.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but go ahead.
No, of course not. Talking over Zoom always has that little gap that makes that happen. Right,
exactly.
But, no, I will say that there's the data on parenting is very clear. Like there's authoritarian parenting, which is harmful for kids, and permissive parenting, which is harmful for kids. But what is called authoritative parenting, where love and some freedom, but also rule setting and boundary setting is the most healthy for kids. And that's generally speaking, what it is seen that God is attempting to do in his relationship with us, both as Jews and Christians understand it. Also, in the Ten Commandments, there is the against, do not covet, which is a feeling, that is, or a desire that is. So the idea that it doesn't, that this is a dichotomy between rules and actions. I like your talking about your disposition and existential posture. Those are really good. Again, those are other things about love that I hear Christians talk about all the time. Love is not just a feeling; it's these things. So, one of the things before I get into some other questions, I think on the Jewish versus Christian question, which I think are interesting, I was curious. What are some of the things as you were, because one of the things that really impressed me about this book is how not only thorough and sensible it is in trying walking through some of these things, but how almost kind of poetically joyful it was in describing a God who loves us. I would even, I don't think it is, how should I put this, disrespectful to say it almost felt psalm-like, where you're to say it like a psalm, where you're saying as to where there's a joyful praise to a God who loves us in this way. So there's a poetry in it as well as an essay-like, logical treatise. And I could feel your joy, your love for God who loves you this way in the writing of it, which is one of the beautiful things about reading this book, experiencing that and feeling that.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. No, I really mean that. So I'm kind of wondering, as you're writing this book, did you have an experience of learning more about, the ways that God loves you as you're kind of researching this book, as you're writing this book, kind of new kind of understandings or revelations about that? And if so, kind of what were they?
It's a really interesting question. So let me answer it more in a sort of scholarly way and then in a more personal way.
That's fantastic. I'm all for it.
Great. So the scholarly way, I spent so many years teaching about various aspects of love in the Jewish tradition, and then an embarrassing number of years also working on this book. I felt like I discovered new things every week, texts I had never seen, modern thinkers. I mean, one of the things I do in this book that may not be obvious to Christian readers is I quote a lot of ultra-Orthodox rabbinic figures who are not usually part of this kind of discourse. I learned a tremendous amount about the prioritization of love and compassion in all kinds of different parts of the Jewish tradition in ways that never ceased to move me and also really, really challenged me. I sometimes say, although I hesitate to say it because it feels, I don't know, it feels almost cloying to me to say it, but I'll say it anyway, which is this book working on this book made me feel a certain kind of religious anxiety about whether I have ever truly loved a God who loves widows and orphans, and what it would mean to worship a God who truly sees those we refuse to. I feel goaded by that. I feel challenged by that. I work hard not to feel deflated by it. I think like any good spiritual teaching, the challenge is how do we experience it as motivating rather than crushing? So there was a lot. There was really, really a lot. And a whole one that I suspect you might want to talk about later, but I don't know. The whole question about the Jewish approach to loving enemies was an area that I only started to research when I started working on this book. It was one of the later things for me to work on. And it was a little bit like being in a kind of storm-tossed trip in that, I read sources that were coming out in all kinds of different ways in different places. And I was really, all of my conventional assumptions were upended. So there's that. And then, on a personal level, I think if you write a book like this and your heart is in it, you can't help but ask yourself, like, who am I to write a book like this? How am I writing a book about love? Like, who do I think I am? And there's a phrase that I ended up kind of coining for myself, which is sort of awkward, but which is that sometimes when we write, we have to write beyond our being. We write what we aspire to. So I would never in 1,000 years claim to be an embodiment of any of these chapters, let alone all of them. But they are a kind of lodestar, a kind of, guiding light for me. And they mark out for me what I aspire to and what I aspire to convey to my students as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's one of the, may appreciate this, but one of the metaphors that I've grown to really appreciate in my relationship with God is the picture of wrestling with God. Because, and the thing about, as I've lurked into child psychology, like you see the importance of parents wrestling with their children, like how basically parents, if children who don't have parents that wrestle with them don't learn how to gain confidence. They don't learn how far is too far in being aggressive. And so they either become mice or monsters because they don't know what that line is of like, when is wrestling positive and fun? When is it harmful? And one of the things about wrestling is that the parent's job is to push you just beyond like where you're capable of so you can grow. So you can, and I see that in my relationship with God is that, and that I'm never, when I see, who God is versus who I am, and I'm continuing to wrestle with it, I'm never get there. But if I wrestle with it, I get further than where I am. And so I agree with that just like wrestling with God's identity as a God of love and his, charge, demand, admonition, encouragement, whatever word you want to do, to more closely reflect that. You're right. You can look at that and be like, well, I can never reach the ideal, and therefore, what's the point? Or you can say, well, I can get better than I was yesterday, and I can feel encouraged by that and excited by that growth. And that's, again, just as a personal matter in my spiritual religious journey, that's been extremely positive for me as I've been growing in that area. So I resonate a lot with what you're saying there, is all to say.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that I really struggled with in working on this book, but more fundamentally in my own kind of just, religious life, is I think there's a very strong impulse in the Jewish tradition to affirm that God believes in us, in some sense more than we believe in ourselves. And that's one of the reasons that God is so forgiving, is that God wants to sort of like give us another chance to do it better.
Yeah.
And I don't know, we live in a time in which I think it wouldn't be crazy to doubt human nature. And so I always felt sort of challenged by that God believes in you. The conclusion of the book, if I remember correctly, I talk about this midrash. It says that God believed in the world and therefore created it. Such a moving image. I would say I don't always believe it, but I'm always inspired by it.
Yeah. No, I think that makes sense. I mean, again, going to the child psychology thing, the Christians have this idea, of the polar ideas of justification versus sanctification. That, sanctification is how you grow to be more like God, and justification is you being accepted regardless of your behavior. And oftentimes, and again, we looking at the child psychology bit, you see that children need both, to be held sort of by their mother, which is sort of, which is like, hey, I'm completely dependent on you. Regardless of your behavior, I'm there for you. And then they need to be wrestled with by their father, so to speak. And so like, okay, I'm going to grow with you in there. And so there is this aspect kind of in Christian theology and the letters of Paul and such, that's like God is going to treat you as righteous before you are righteous. You're, in the parental, parents believe that you are worth investing in as a child before you actually manifest any of those things. And it seems that people need that. People need to be say, okay, I'm going to believe that you are worth investing in and believing in before we manifest those things. And that's while also recognizing that we aren't manifesting those things. We have to recognize that we're not manifesting those things. Again, Richard Dawkins talked about like one of the worst ideas. He says, sort of in the New Testament, as he put it, was the idea that we're sinners. That we were born sinners. And I think there's some degree in which I understand what he means, because he's saying like, oh, there's the fact that to say that we're not be imputed as righteous, because of that we're just kind of, as the Matrix sort of put it, humans are locusts, or as Charles Dickens sort of parodied in one of his books. It's his New Year's one. I forget what it's called. After Christmas Carol, he was like, okay, I'm going to do all holiday ones now. But one of the ideas is that, human beings are intruding. That's the idea. If you have that idea, that's certainly kind of an anti-human idea. But the idea that we're born kind of deeply flawed is not, an anti-human idea. It's just like a not delusional one. The most violent human beings on the planet statistically are males at the age of 2. There's one psychologist who said serial killers are not made, they're unmade. And some people we fail to unmake from their serial killer instincts. Right. And so there's definitely, I'll just say, that dichotomy that I understand is like, we need to sort of be treated as righteous before we manifest it. Without it, we don't have the opportunity to do so. And that's really deeply moving and inspiring. And one of the things that people who come to Christianity are deeply moved and inspired by. It's like, oh man, he's treating me this way. Even before.
Right, I mean, this is very much related to one of the things I talk about in the first chapter of the book and return to in other places is the idea that God's love is not something we earn, but something that we always already have. And if anything, we strive to live up to that love, not to earn it. And I think that means that, to come into the world, to be loved, knowing that, I didn't do anything to earn this. It's a gift, or, to use a word that is essential to Judaism, but that also Jews were told they didn't have. It's grace, right? It's unearned. It's an unearned gift. And that's what divine love really is, ultimately. One of the things that's kind of become important to me, and just thinking about being a parent, is the idea that divine love comes with expectations, but without conditions.
Ooh, elaborate on that. That's really cool. I like that.
I think that a lot of us get confused. I've heard this from parents, actually. I'm not in these words, obviously, but that they sometimes get tripped up. They think that loving their kid unconditionally means telling them that whatever they did was great. And I would say that's exactly wrong, right? Yeah. I have expectations. If my kid hurts another child, I'm going to tell him that that's not acceptable. I'm not going to love him any less, right? Or people end up thinking, because I have expectations, my love is conditional. Or, and that's also totally backwards. I think we really have to dichotomize almost between, not dichotomize, that's not actually a helpful way of saying it. We have to distinguish clearly between love and expectation, and crucially to understand that expectations stem from love. If I have no expectations of you, then on some level, I don't respect you. If I say, just do what you want for the rest of your life, right? You want to just like play video games for all eternity? Go for it. I'm not taking you seriously. And I'm certainly not treating you with the kind of love that I ought to have for you.
Yeah. So no, somebody who doesn't. Yeah, somebody who knows what's best for you, but doesn't try to expect and admonish and encourage you in that direction, doesn't really love you, because you know that there's a way that's better and worse for you, and you're not helping them get there. So,
right. The only challenge, though, I would just say, Joseph, that the challenge in this is how to hold that view without becoming an imperialist, right? I mean, the history of religion is filled with people who were slaughtered because other people knew what was good for them better than they did. And that's a really challenging point, I think.
Absolutely. Well, so this is going to get into some really interesting territory. I want to transition, to talking about some of the ways in which you discuss sort of some of the actual differences as you see them between Judaism and Christianity, because this book, as you said, is explicitly sort of part of a dialectic between Judaism and Christianity, because Christians have said this is the difference between Judaism and Christianity for and they've been the majority, so they've had the biggest megaphone for a couple thousand years, and you're wanting to reclaim and say no, Judaism is also about love, but you also then say, but here are the differences, as some of the differences as I understand them, to kind of push that conversation in a different direction. And I really appreciate, because there is a temptation a lot of times I see in some of this discourse to, in order to correct some of the discussions of differences, to pretend like there aren't differences at all, and just in different discussions like that, and not actually say, no, here's where the line is and where the debate needs to happen. I like the fact that you say, no, there is a debate and let's have it, but let's just put it in the right place. So I want to kind of unpack some of the things that you talk about. You list, you can remind me of the ones that I'm forgetting some of them, but you talk about a couple of ones which I think are interesting. One is the loving your enemies one. The other is and this sort of the missional aspect, and that kind of goes into some of the universal aspect. And the ones I think are most interesting, and kind of want to talk about. In addition to one other thing I think is interesting later if we have time, but is the loving your enemies and the missional aspect of this. So can you unpack a little bit where you saw, because you talk about the loving your enemies as a kind of a difference between Judaism and Christianity, at least in emphasis. But then you do kind of talk about the complexity of that question when you dive into it. So would you kind of develop for our listeners kind of what you mean by that to set that up, that discussion?
Yeah, sure. So, it's probably helpful to say, as a way of framing this, that I'm very taken with a phrase I learned from the Christian theologian Delwyn Brown, who talks about how traditions, he's actually talking about canons, but traditions, he says, are not monoliths, they're multiliths. Meaning they contain many voices within them. So as soon as anyone says, Judaism says X, Christianity says Y, you should get very suspicious, because Judaism probably says X and Y, and so does Christianity. So I think it's important to just, when someone says something like, you might hear, Christianity says love your enemies, but Jews say defend yourself, something like that. So first of all, I'm not sure that's a proper dichotomy. You might want to say love your enemies and defend yourself against them, but also, Judaism and Christianity both say, a lot of different things about this. So what do I mean? What's some examples of this? Well, first of all, one of the things that I have learned over the years now of researching love your enemies in the Christian tradition is that as central as Christians agree that mandate is, they don't often agree on exactly what it entails or requires, right? So I don't know, does loving your enemies apply primarily or exclusively in the interpersonal sphere, or does it also apply to the political? Does loving your enemies require pacifism, or actually are there times when one is morally and spiritually required to take up arms? Just for a couple of examples, right? And similarly, in the Jewish tradition, so on the one hand, every day, 3 times a day, we pray that our hearts be silent in the face of those who curse us, right? Certainly the spirit of non-retaliation is totally essential. And the rabbis valorize, the sages, that is, the Talmudic sages, praise no end those who are insulted and do not insult in return, right? So there's that piece. And then, see, here's where this topic got really messy for me. I found over time that neither tradition is served well, if I can be so bold. I'm willing to say it about Judaism. It's a little over the top for me to say about Christianity, but it was my experience of learning that we don't often clarify what we're talking about when we talk about loving our enemies. So, I mean, think about the ways someone could use the word enemy. They could be talking somewhat colloquially about someone at work they really don't get along with. They could be talking about an old friend they had a terrible falling out with and don't speak to anymore. They could be talking about Saddam Hussein, right? Those are not all the same thing, right? And so one of the things that I want to sort of try and do as a philosopher is just sort of like ask, can we kind of refine our terms a little bit?
Can we define our terms? Yes.
Yes. Can we define what we're talking about? Now, I found some Jewish sources that really struck me in their kind of completely breaking the mold of the way we stereotype traditions. Because on the one hand, there's this mandate in Jewish law that if someone is coming to kill you, you have to kill them first, right? Very much a non-pacifistic ethic around that, ethic of self-defense. On the other hand, building on a verse from Proverbs, the Midrash says, if someone comes to your house to kill you, but they're hungry, feed them. And then God will reconcile the two of you. Now, that's a midrash. It's not a piece of legislation. And I think what it's meant to do is to just kind of put 1 second's pause. I know that there are certain situations where the only option is to take up arms. Am I sure this is one of those situations? Mm-hmm. So forgive me if I'm answering this in a kind of rambling way, but what I'm trying to suggest is that each tradition is more complicated, and what each tradition says is really up for discussion. Where I do think there is a distinction is when you read Christian writers saying, love of enemies is the very heart of Christian ethics. I don't think you're going to find Jewish thinkers who say that. And one of the reasons why I think, is that a culture that is in power will often be enabled to talk and think in different ways than a culture that is fundamentally disempowered. Jews have felt the need to defend themselves. By the way, tragically, often in the face of marauding Christians, right? That's what's so complicated. And I think one of the things that makes a conversation about loving enemies in Judaism and Christianity so difficult for many Jews is that I think if we're really going to be honest, the kind of interfaith conversation that's real is to say that Jews hear Christians talk about loving enemies, and they often think, wait a minute, first you defined us as the enemy, and then you killed us, and then you preached to us about not loving enemies. That just seems like hypocritical at best and outrageous at worst. And I think that that's just really complex. It's and I love what you said before. I think interfaith conversations, if they're going to be real, have to be more than politeness, and certainly more than just saying, oh, well, all religions are the same. They have to be about real conversations. But in the case of Judaism and Christianity, it requires really being honest about tremendous damage, murder, right? That's been done. And that's a really hard piece, I think.
Yeah. No, I think this is interesting. One of the things that I think that's really fascinating to bring that up. If there is distinction, it's sort of in the traditions that there's a lot more voices saying Christianity that say this is the central thing. And part of what they do when they're describing that is saying, even in the New Testament, it says Jesus came, to essentially die for his enemies. Like that is what he's doing. And then we should be like Christ, he came into a world that was opposed to him and said, my agenda is I want to bring my enemies to become my family. And so if that's the heart of what Jesus' mission was, that's the heart of Christianity, so to speak. And there's going to be fewer Jewish writers who will say the same thing, that at the heart of Judaism is God wanting to reconcile with his enemies. Now, I will say that, obviously agreeing that, there's pretty close to 2,000 years of Christians being really awful to people who were out of power, including and especially the Jews. I'll say what's interesting, where I would push back on how you're describing it, is that a lot of this theology, not all of it obviously, but a lot of this theology about loving your enemies, particularly the ones that's in the New Testament where they've been calling it central, was written before Christians were in power, and written about during times when they were being persecuted, both by Jewish authorities but especially by Roman authorities. And so a lot of this theology was first being put forward by Jesus and by Paul, and its centrality was during the time when they were the ones being persecuted and saying, hey, these people who are abusing you, and it's certainly in the context of Jesus, he was talking about, hey, the Romans who are abusing you and the Jewish people, this is how you should treat them as well. And so I don't think it's as simple as, well, the people in power really like to the loving your enemies thing and the people out of power don't.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And if I suggested that, then I was drawing the line too sharply. I think my point was more that for much of Christian history, there was less at stake in talking about loving your enemies than there was in much of Jewish history, given the disparities of power. But I didn't mean to essentialize that. If that's how I came across, I would formulate it differently. But yeah, go ahead.
But your point being that there certainly was an incentive for a lot longer in Christian history to develop that as central than there was in Judaism to develop that as central for the past 2,000 years in any case. That would be sort of the point you're making.
Yeah, I mean, incentive is an interesting word there. I would say more plausibility, less
Sure.
immense difficulty, less constant fear of being obliterated, which really, I think you can't understand Jewish texts without certainly, pre-modern Jewish texts,
Sure.
pre-Holocaust Jewish texts, pre-State of Israel Jewish texts, whatever you want to say, right? Without realizing how much of Jewish experience has been kind of bound up with a sense of immense physical vulnerability. Here's an example of this, which might be of interest. One of the classic works of medieval Jewish philosophy is by Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, Judah Halevi, a book called the Kuzari. And the Kuzari develops an idea that many moderns find understandably very disturbing, which is that there is something that Jews have, some almost quasi-biological quality that enables them to be prophets. Okay? And this is disturbing because it's a certain kind of essentialism that we want to, I think, avoid, right? And yet, what I often tell students is if you want to understand the Kuzari, don't ever forget its subtitle, In Defense of a Despised Religion. Now, what you say when you are despised and powerless has to be different than what you say when you then become powerful. I mean, one of the things I think is interesting about, modern Israeli ethics is like, what do you do with a tradition that developed much of its talk about ethics in a time of powerlessness and now is speaking in a time when it has power? Those are really hard questions. That's really what I'm raising, is that like the context matters a lot.
I think that's true. I would just say that I would just kind of caution that mode of logic to not over-interpret the centrality of loving enemies as being too reduced to those power dynamics. I think it was
Agreed.
that was
Agreed.
but it should. But
I think
we're
not disagreeing about this.
No. So that's cool. Again, that's one of the fun things about these discussions is how they can develop in that way. The other thing is, and this gets into sort of the missional part, which again, this is really interesting to me, is so and again, I'm going to talk about my perspective as in the words of many of my Jewish friends, is I am a goy, so and so definitely I have a particular perspective on the missional aspect of vis-a-vis Judaism and Christianity. But one of the things I'm grateful for as a descendant of the European barbarians is the fact that someone was missional enough to spread many of these great Jewish ethics and understanding of God to my ancestors. As Tom Holland has famously written about in his book Dominion, if you look at the actual ethics and practices and beliefs of the Greco-Roman world, and that we often romanticize, and the pagan world we often romanticize when white people try to say, let's get back to like pre-Christian Europe, it's like, no, you really don't want to. Lots of infanticide, lots of awful sexual practices, lots of sexism that honestly makes, medieval sexism and 1950s sexism look quaint. So you really don't want. And so when I see the missional aspect of Christianity that developed that said, where our job is to make disciples of all nations, I definitely can see how awful that could be perverted into, okay, let's now use the sword to force everybody who doesn't agree with us to conform to all of the things that we believe. I definitely see the problems with that. But I also say, if there wasn't this idea that God wants to, save the whole world, my culture would still be in darkness. And so for me, that missional aspect is one great evidence that God is a God of love, that he wants what the Jews had, what he developed in the Jewish people. He wants to spread that everywhere. and again, even the law aspect is a little bit complicated because again, all of my friends who are like, evil, Christian colonialism, stuff like that, all cheer when they find out the British Empire, banned slavery everywhere and actually sent their ships out to destroy slave trade ships. And so even that is complicated, even though generally I agree with it on the imperialism aspect of it. So kind of, I guess one of the things, so I agree that Christianity has long had a missional aspect, and it's a missional aspect that's more missional than I observe in the Jewish, my Jewish neighbors and the Jewish, traditions, as I understand. So it makes intuitive sense that there's more of a missional emphasis in Christianity than Judaism. But I guess a couple questions related to that. So you say the kind of the talk about Judaism being a light to the Gentiles is you kind of think that that's something that should be interpreted a bit more narrowly than Christians will often interpret it. And I guess so my two-part question, and feel free to ramble on this because I've set you up with a ramble. You deserve a ramble in response. And those are my favorite answers anyway. But is the narrow definition of light to the Gentiles one that is a consensus sort of within Judaism, or is it kind of like a controversy? And also, how would you? Because for me, a God who wants to save everyone is more of a God of love than one who kind of wants to keep, is less missional. And so, how would you say that? Argue against that a God who is a bit more standoffish in terms of the missional is maybe more of a God of love than a missional God of love.
Yeah, that's actually a lot of questions rolled into one. So let me try to say a few things. I might even need you to remind me along the way of some of what I'm talking about.
Of course, yeah.
But, so first of all, I don't think that I would make the dichotomy between missional and standoffish. I think that the issue really is, from I think a Jewish theological perspective, is that you can be, to coin a term, good with God without being Jewish. Sure. That is to say, God can have relationship with other persons and other peoples without needing them to be converted to one and the same religion and one and the same way of worshiping God. So it's not that if Judaism has a particularist story, that means because God doesn't care about everyone else. It's that God doesn't need to convert everyone else to Judaism. And that's one of the ways that traditional Judaism and traditional Christianity are different, right? You don't have a notion in Judaism of no salvation outside the synagogue. That's not a Jewish idea. Now, as I say in this book, I don't think Judaism is particularistic. I think Judaism is particularistically universalist, right? That is to say, we affirm that God loves every human being on the face of the earth. We dream of a redemption that includes, the whole earth. It's really about converting people. And Jews have not usually been preoccupied with that. The language that I have found helpful, I use it in this book, and I use it a lot in my teaching because it really just sort of is stark. It's probably too stark, and yet I think it's helpful, is that Jews have always excelled at leaving other people alone. And where they have sometimes stumbled is that they have forgotten that other people matter too. Christians, in contrast, have always excelled at remembering that everyone matters, but it took Christians 2,000 years to even consider leaving anybody alone. And that's a trade-off, right? Sure, it's kind of rather than just saying, and this one is therefore better than the other, I think it's always more helpful to say, so what's at stake here? What are the consequences of certain positions? And the fact is that historically, one of the things that has always marched hand in hand with a certain kind of universalism is, in fact, imperialism.
Sure.
Right? And Judaism does not have an imperial impulse. It has other, if we wanted to have fun, we could have a little drinking game. What are the sort of like the most problematic aspects of each religious tradition?
Sure. Yeah.
Judaism has never been, let's conquer the world. right?
Sure.
It's just it's a different set of problems that we can talk about, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So that's what I, am trying to get at, and I think here too, I would say being a minority culture affects contemporary Jews because it is very common to internalize the majority culture's understanding of a value system. So, I hear this from Jewish college students, right? Universalism is good, particularism is bad. And I just say, can we complicate that picture just a little bit? Right. And in an age after Christendom, maybe it's actually important for Christians to do that too, because, they're not in the same kind of power as they once were. So that's one piece. Now, about the light unto the nations, I would say that what I argue there is very much not a consensus. There are many Jewish thinkers, and you find this amplified in modernity across denominational lines. This notion that Jews have a mission not to convert the world to Judaism usually, but to convert the world to, depending on where we're talking about, ethical monotheism, something like that. That section of my book, specifically about the light unto the nations, that's the part of me that is sort of like preoccupied with biblical scholarship and was very focused on figuring out, to the extent that we can, of course, what did whoever wrote that prophecy in Isaiah mean, right? Now, what I didn't do in that chapter is really develop as much, if I recall correctly, as much about how have Jews heard that verse in different times and different places. I was really interested, if you will, I was doing something very Protestant. I was returning to the source, right? And trying to, kind of play with that. And I thought that maybe it was helpful. In some ways, I wrote that passage for Christian readers because I wanted them to see that even some of the passages that are most loved are actually complex and even elusive.
Sure.
That was part of what I was trying to do there. So I think, and by the way, this is a question that I always ask this to Christian theologian friends, which is like, okay, do you think that someone has to be a Christian in order to, I don't know, whatever language you want to use, go to heaven, right?
Be saved, whatever,
Be saved, right. And because that is just such not a Jewish way of thinking. And because as I think you can imagine, Jews tend to be, you want to press a religious Jew's buttons, it's telling him, oh, you have to convert to Christianity or else God rejects you. Right. That is, that is like, well, really, Now, if I could say something about one other thing you said here that I think is worth saying, is that, on the one hand, I would say that in Jewish tradition, there are two impulses around Christianity. I'm just going to be really blunt here.
Please.
One impulse is to kind of write it off as a kind of diluted monotheism or worse. After all, there's one God, not three. I realize I'm being right. No. And then there's another voice that says, wait a minute. Christianity, for all its anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, and for all the theological disagreements we have, has brought the word of the God of the Hebrew Bible all over the world. Clearly, Christianity has some role in God's outworking of God's relationship with all of humanity. What I find fascinating, Joseph, is that you have some thinkers who will say both things. Maimonides is a great example of this. Maimonides is an extremely insistent, robust philosophical monotheist. Right? That's one of the reasons Maimonides loves Islam in a certain way and has a lot of issues with Christianity. Because he sees Muslims and he says, well, they're obsessed with monotheism, whereas Christians are always talking about three. I don't know what they're talking about. Right? And at the same time, Maimonides then says, clearly Christianity has some role to play in the redemption of human history. Right? I mean, it brought the Torah on some level in its own understanding, admittedly, right? But it brought the Torah to countless thousands of people. So I think that's really complicated. And you have versions of this in Franz Rosenzweig in modern Jewish thought, people who are trying to find ways to say, on the one hand, Judaism doesn't need a story where it explains God's relationship to the whole world. God is bigger than we are. And clearly there is some role that Christianity is playing. Like those things are both true.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I think that, and it's interesting. The early Christian church did a certain interesting kind of hybrid of these things, where it had a church of Jewish and Gentile Christians, where it's like, and it did where it's like, hey, and it's funny because Paul was, in Romans, you realize a lot of him saying is that, look, you don't have to be Jewish to be a Christian. But the assumption was in the church there were going to be Jewish Christians who weren't supposed to stop being Jews just because they were Christians. And there were Gentile Christians who didn't have to become Jewish in order to be Christians. There was this idea that to a certain degree, you could define it as this broader ethical monotheism, with Jesus as the, as the prophet who's, the prophet, son of God, who's leading that, was right. The idea. And of course, and I think you point this out, that an idea that Christianity is supposed to replace Judaism is a very lazy misinterpretation of what Paul's saying. But that idea is kind of how it started out, which I think is very interesting to me. One of the things I want to talk about again, because this is a very an extremely rightly controversial kind of aspect of the relationship between Jews and Christians but one that I find very interesting. I want to kind of pick your brain about because you bring it up, is how Judaism changed after the destruction of the temple. Because, and I want to make sure that I'm interpreting sort of what you're saying correctly, because I think this conversation between Christians and Jews is interesting to me. Because even though obviously the reasons for human suffering and suffering of God's people were always very complex in Judaism, there was a strong element of it that was a lot of our suffering can be explained by disobedience to God. So to a certain degree, it's like, our exile was because of disobedience to God. So there's a certain degree to which, even if we don't understand things, we know that there is an ethical order to the universe that we conform to, stuff like that. That's like, okay, some of the suffering in the world is not our fault, and some of it is our fault. But post-destruction of the temple, there really was the sense in which, how do we make sense of this when we are being faithful to God? We haven't done obvious, flagrant problems, and we still lost one of the central aspects of our faith. And so there's a certain sense in which Judaism had to evolve, not to, I don't want to say as far as to be a different faith, but a vastly different understanding kind of itself, and how it saw God's relationship, where there are less answers to why are we suffering in this way. And what I think is interesting about that, and this is, I want to give you this fuller context so that you can respond to it, is that this was often one of the central arguments in New Testament books and early Christians, was right. That we have an answer to this question, which is that, we are holding to traditional theology that part of the reason that this happened was the rejection of Jesus. Jesus is at the very least, the equivalent of someone like Moses, who, if you reject God's prophet and his words, you're rejecting him. And that would be an explanation for why the temple was destroyed. They say that explicitly, or close to explicitly, in many New Testament passages. Now, and so that was their attempt to say, actually, we're the true extension of this faith. And now, even though that was a pretty uphill battle, because a lot of their understandings of God were also very different from traditional understandings, right. Of of the Messiah, how he would come and stuff, like, were very different for understandings. But that was a kind of an aspect of the debate that was going on, was that there was this huge seismic change in Judaism, and everybody kind of had to deal with it. And the Christians had one explanation, and the Jews who didn't believed that Jesus was the Messiah had another explanation. And of course, that became a justification by later Christians to say, well, since you've rejected Christ, you're not the true faith anymore. We get to persecute you. Is me kind of understanding that conversation in that way an accurate way to describe the conversation, and how would you phrase it or talk about it differently?
Yeah, that's a big one. So I mean, so I want to first say that I think in the Bible, by which I mean the Hebrew Bible for a minute,
right.
In the Hebrew Bible, you already have moments when biblical writers say, I know that the arrangement is supposed to be that when we're faithful, things are good, and when we're unfaithful, things go bad. But God, it doesn't seem to work that way. I mean, the most dramatic example of this is Psalm 44, one of the most beautiful and impossibly painful psalms in Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible, which basically says, God, we've been faithful, but you have not. So I just think it's important to say that always there has been, the paradigm of, if you behave, it'll be good. If you don't behave, it'll be bad. That paradigm always had cracks in it, always had dissenting voices. I think it's just important to acknowledge those dissenting voices are early in the, are part of the biblical canon.
100%.
So that's piece number one. And here I actually think that the Bible scholar Walter Brueggemann's formulation is sort of helpful. It's a very Christian sounding way of putting it, but that the Bible contains both a testimony and a counter testimony. I found that actually in some ways quite helpful for thinking about some of these texts, that I've spent a lot of time teaching, like the Psalms of Lament. Now, I think it's true that Christians in the first century, and when I should be clear that when you're talking about destruction of the temple, you mean the destruction of the second temple, right?
Right. Yes.
But I just want to make sure listeners are with us in what we're talking about.
Totally good. Thank you for that. That's good. Yeah.
So the destruction of the second temple, it's true that Christians had this story whereby there was an explanation in the traditional paradigm, and Jews were really groping. And the rabbis used that as an opportunity to say some, I think, spiritually and ethically very profound things, like that the Second Temple was destroyed based on gratuitous hatred. That is to say, it's not just big sins, quote unquote, like idolatry and sexual immorality. It's also just interpersonal brutality. Right. So there is a major strand of rabbinic literature that sees the destruction of the Second Temple as falling into the traditional paradigm. But the kind of sin that it's talking about is not like abandoning the covenant wholesale or rejecting the Messiah. It's something much more different. It's humiliating people. It's degrading people. It's not understanding that worshiping God has to radically transform how you interact in everyday life. That said, it's clear that the rabbis are also groping because they don't, unlike the Jews at the time of the first destruction, they don't think they deserved it, if you will, in the same way. And what I would say is that in the history of Jewish thought, there became this deep skepticism about measuring how good with God, to return to that silly phrase, how good with God you are based on how much earthly political power you have. And that is one of the, I never really thought about it like this until we're having this conversation. So Joseph, forgive me, I'll try this on for a minute. There's a deep historical irony here, which is that Christianity that worshipped a God who in a fundamental way, on some level, celebrated his own powerlessness and renunciation of power, Christians felt confirmed in their superiority by the extent of their earthly power. And Jews who had a narrative about, inherited this biblical narrative about, if you do X, then there will be Y, actually felt like, well, that's not the right measure. So in a funny way, both religions were stretched in some very complex ways by the unfolding of history. I will just mention that for Jews, this conversation reached a kind of crescendo in the 20th century in the wake of the Shoah, in the wake of the Holocaust,
Yeah.
where the whole question of what it means to talk about a God of history became so incredibly painful. And then, of course, I mean, separately, you have a whole array of Christian theologians who say, wait a minute, to the extent that we might have in some indirect way or direct way contributed to this means that we fundamentally have to rethink who we are and what we've inherited, right? So the Holocaust is a kind of caesura, like a kind of a shattering. And I think because it's modern times, you have Jewish thinkers much more willing to explicitly say, look, I don't know how to talk about a God who's involved in history anymore. In earlier periods, you hint at that, you gesture at that with stories, right? It's not quite at the surface in the same way.
Yeah, absolutely.
And of course, the irony is, irony, right? The end of Christendom, the weakening of Christianity basically weakens that Christian argument against Judaism in a whole new way, which is like, oh, well, if we're going to measure the truth or veracity or whatever of a religion based on how much control it has over human history, Christianity is in a downward spiral, right? That's interesting.
Yep. Yeah. I think that the flip side of that, I think, is I would say is that Christians in their story are able to say that, well, we weren't told, in so many words, that the sign of our truth was going to be, or that we were holding to the truth was going to be that we're going to have to some degree a certain kind of society. Jesus was like, hey, here's how you will know is you'll love others and people will persecute you, which is one of the ways we have as we can also go wrong is being like, okay, there's a parody article by a Christian satire site, Babylon Bee, that was saying, area man unsure if people hate him because he's a Christian or because he's a jerk,
Right.
And so there's that aspect of it. So I don't know if that quite Christians are having quite that same identity crisis of who are we, is our faith wrong if we're not in power? But I will say that there is a reimagining happening. Again, I reviewed the book Life in the Negative World, which is talking about very much about that. Okay, what does it look like for a post-Christian age?
But I think also, Joseph, correct me if I'm wrong here, but it does seem that in parts of the American evangelical church, there's a tremendous amount of rage about Christianity's loss of power.
Oh, absolutely. There's definitely
right?
there is a rage, but I would say there's a rage about the loss of power, and the explanations around it are interesting. Typically, it's about how have we failed in some way, or what's the conspiracy? Who's out there doing this?
Right.
And it's just sort of different. It's definitely the same rage and the same groping at explanations. I would just say that there are different kinds of explanations and different kinds of groping. But yes.
By the way, sorry, I want to add one footnote to this, which is a topic for another podcast on another year. If the Holocaust raised the question of the God of history to a whole new decibel level, the birth of the state of Israel just a few years later made the conversation downright miasmic, right? Dizzying, which is, wait a minute. We have had at one and the same time a sense of God abandoning us and a sense of God having performed an almost unprecedented miracle for us. And that left a lot of Jews quite dizzy. Right, the 20th century is really, really complex in that way. That's maybe a topic for another day.
Right, of course. And I don't want to do too much on this. I'll say that I reviewed for Religion Unplugged last year the Adam Sandler comedy of You're So Not Invited at My Bat Mitzvah, which was not a good movie. It was not a good movie. You don't have to see it. You can just read my review. You'll get everything good out of it. But
okay.
One of the things that I think was fascinating, the best scene in the movie was you had all of these children in the schools basically asking questions. Hey, teacher, why does God have allow this bad thing to happen? Whether it's to the Holocaust or whether it's climate change, and it's like why does God prohibit this or that? And the teacher says, those are great questions, and here's my answer. She takes out this ukulele and says, God is random. God is random. And, and I was curious, kind of, I was like, okay, I want to see what's, I explore some of this because it's interesting. It's interesting to me that, because it definitely is reflective. It's not entirely reflective of my experience in Christian circles about this, but there is that questioning about why is God like this that happens. It certainly happens in modernity as you get into modernity and a whole new way of looking at things happen. So these how different groups deal with these questions is really fascinating to me, and I'm trying to grow in my kind of understanding of interfaith dialogue in this way. So that's one of the reasons that this book was so fascinating to me, and I enjoyed it so much. Now, I will say that if you have time for like one more question, that's kind of that you don't bring up in the book, but wanted to hear a rabbi's kind of opinion of, because this is something that I hear in Christian circles sometimes, and that I would really like to have a Jewish perspective on. One of the things you'll hear Christians talk about vis-a-vis the Trinity, is that the Trinity is one way that they experience God being a God of love, because if you say God, there's one God, but within God, there are three persons. That means that God is both one and a family. And love is best understood and expressed as love between, love of someone else, love between someone else. If God is eternal and always existed before he created anything else, how could he be a God of love before anything else existed to love, unless there was to some degree a way of there being love within God. So God is one, but also a family. And that's less of a theological argument than a poetic kind of exploration. It is theological. It's theological understanding of God. Right. But I would wonder, so like, what would be sort of a Jewish response about that, either critiquing that, but also just kind of saying, how do you conceive of a God of love being a God of love prior to creating anything just on his own? How does your understanding of love and God kind of explore that without use of the Trinity?
I find that to be just a wonderfully rich question, because I think it elicits, it gets at some really deep theological pieces here. I want to mention, I have to confess, I have not read this yet. I'm not even sure it's out yet. But a colleague of mine, Rabbi Alan Brill, who's a Jewish theologian, has a book coming out on Jewish approaches to the Christian Trinity, which I suspect many of your listeners might find interesting. I haven't read the book. I think Alan knows a tremendous amount about Christianity. Will have more to say on this probably than I will. I think that, in a funny way, Jews and Christians in this discussion often each got hung up on their critiques of the other. So Christians said, well, wait a minute. How can you talk about a God of love if there's not a family within God? And Jews said, I thought you were monotheists. And then you read someone like Jürgen Moltmann who says, I'm not a monotheist, I'm a Trinitarian. And you're like, what? That's a wait, So I think we often get sort of hung up on where the other's failure is. Perceived failure, whatever.
Sure.
Yeah. I think that what Jewish thinkers would likely say about this is twofold, or maybe two different kinds of Jewish thinkers. One would say that's why almost the creation of the world had to be. Because God was a God who was yearning for someone to love, right? If you have an Aristotelian first cause, or unmoved mover, then it's like, how can you talk about God of love? But, you have all the Jewish spiritual texts that say God wanted someone to love. God was like, look, I'm God, but I want relationship too. That's how deep relationship is in the world, is that I want it. And so God creates a world and human beings within it in order to be able to love and show grace to. It's just a different way. I mean, it's not as metaphysical an answer in the sense that it's not like, oh, there's love taking place within the Godhead. I suspect that some Jewish thinkers would say, I am a little bit wandering out on a limb here. This is not an area where I live. Kabbalists would be willing to talk about how different sphirot, different aspects of the Godhead, love each other.
Okay.
And one of the comments that a Jewish theologian named Michael Wishegrad mentioned, Michael Wishegrad, very much, in some ways, much more influential in Christian circles than in Jewish ones, even though he was an Orthodox Jew. Wishegrad actually says, well, the reason why Jews don't have to be so offended by the Trinity is that the parts of the Trinity get along with each other. It would really be a problem if they were pulling in different directions.
Sure.
It's just interesting. I mean, how
Yeah,
Jews,
that is.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I fully answered your question.
No. Again, this is fascinating. Again, and we'll be wrapping up now. But I have to say, like, I'm going to be very honest. This was an incredibly great conversation that really is helpful in terms of understanding kind of my own faith, my own understanding of my faith, and understanding how that looks from the other side and how all of these conversations work well. So thank you so much for
what I most want, which is hard questions. I feel like that's the way to grow, and so I really appreciate that.
Absolutely. Those are my favorite questions to give because they actually help me understand things better. I very much appreciate this. Now, I guess if I assume, obviously everybody check out Rabbi Held's book, Judaism is About Love. I assume available at all of the major, booksellers, the Amazons, the, whatchamacallits.
Yeah.
And if people want to more kind of really enjoy your insights into things, where can people find your other work and go to reach you?
Yeah, thank you. I would suggest probably two things. One is I have a 2-volume collection of essays called The Heart of Torah, which are kind of theological meditations on passages from the Torah that have a bit of a Christian readership as well as a Jewish one. And then also www.hadar.org, HADAR.org, has a lot of my lectures, written material. There's just a lot there, and also from some really spectacular colleagues that I have. And if you're wondering what the word Hadar means, it's Hebrew for glory.
Oh, that's awesome. Love that. Well, thank you so much, Rabbi. This has been phenomenal. And thank you, everybody, for listening. This is Religion Unplugged with all of your best religion, news, and culture.